Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Parsha class, Parsha of Vaera, second Parsha of the book of Shmois, the book of Exodus. We begin with Alachayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvarim. Good morning. Shavuot tov. Oh, Jill's here. Just in time.
Morning, Jill.
So the second Parsha of the book of Shmois, the book of Numbers, the book of Exodus, the book of names. Shmois means names, because we begin with counting or listing the names of Yaakov and his children who came down to Egypt. And we are very much in the midst of the story of Moshe and Pharaoh, God speaking to Moshe being sent to Egypt, speaking to the Jewish people, speaking to Pharaoh. I didn't mention this last week, but really the transition from the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis, to the book of Shmois is really the transition in the formation of the Jewish people from a family to a nation. In other words, in the book of Bereshis, we introduced the patriarchs and the matriarchs and their families and their children, their descendants, and what happened to them as a family, as Yaakov, Jacob, and his children and his grandchildren living in Israel, and what happened to Joseph. But now we turn to the next stage in the formation of the Jewish people, when the Jewish people could become a nation. And becoming a nation starts with hardships, with difficulties. I saw something interesting, kind of jumping ahead a little bit to, in general, throughout the story of the Jewish people and Moshe, we find very little mention of Moshe's children. We know that in last week's Parsha, we know that Moshe had two children, Gershom and Eliezer. These were children that were born to his wife Zipporah, the Midianite, in Midian, outside of Egypt. Two righteous children, where in last week's Parsha, when God told Moshe to go to Egypt, he initially took his wife and his two children along with him. And then when he met Aaron midway, Aaron hasn't seen his brother for many years, perhaps 60 years. Maybe we don't realize this, because in the Torah, it sounds like it's all happened one after another. Moshe, according to the Midrash, left Egypt. He ran away from Pharaoh at the age of 20. And some say he was even younger than that. He was a young man. He returns, he meets God at the burning bush, and he returns to Egypt at the age of 80. So there was at least 60 years in between. Imagine that, right? We read it from like as if today. It was 60 years. So Moshe hasn't spoken to his brother Aaron in 60 years. Perhaps Aaron didn't even know where Moshe was. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It doesn't say that Moshe even told Aaron that, hey, I'm running away, I'm going to Midian. Maybe Aaron knew, perhaps he did, but he hasn't met him for 60 years. So you can imagine that Aaron meets Moshe, and Moshe, Aaron, this is Tzipporah, this is Aaron. These are my children, my two children that were born here and outside of Egypt. And Aaron says, Moshe, are you Meshuggah? The Jewish people are suffering in Egypt, and you're bringing more to Egypt. Leave them here; they're happy. Leave her at the in-laws. That's what the in-laws are meant for, right? Leave Tzipporah with her parents. Leave your children with Zipporah. Come alone. And at the right time, when it's a little settled down, we'll be able to pick them up. We know where they are. They're in good hands. And that's exactly what happened. So Zipporah and the two boys go back home. And when are they reunited with their family? Only after the Jewish people leave Egypt. They leave Egypt. Some say even after they got the Torah. It's unclear exactly, but we have a special parsha named Jethro, the parsha of when Moshe's father-in-law Yisro comes and joins the Jewish people. He didn't stay for long, but he was there. He brought his daughter Tzipporah and his grandchildren with him, and they are reunited. Moshe's family is reunited. So they're not there for all this time. And the truth is, even after that, for the next 40 years, the Jewish people in the desert living with Moshe, there's almost no mention of Moshe's actual children. And when Moshe passes away, who's the successor? It's Joshua. Moshe's children are kind of out of the picture. We don't know much about his children. Well, we know they weren't there, right? They weren't. Aaron's children we know a lot about. Aaron had 4 sons. 2 of them died. 2 of them we know about. Right? We know about Aaron's children. One of them was his successor. And one of the explanations I saw was that because Moshe's children, his sons, were not there in Egypt, they didn't suffer together with the Jewish people. So in a way, they were an outsider. Because they weren't there through all the hardships, so they weren't able to be that leader of the Jewish people when you weren't part of it, when you didn't suffer with them. So that's perhaps why they were never one, with the Jewish people, unlike Aaron's children, etc. I once heard this this little explanation to the reason why we put an egg on our Seder plate. And this is not at all what I prepared for today, but I'm kind of going on a little tangent over here. But we have each item, there's an explanation for it, right? Why we have the shinkbono, why we have the lettuce, the maror, why the egg specifically? We're supposed to have a cooked item to remember one of the sacrifices, the animal sacrifice that we brought. But why specifically an egg? So one of the explanations given is because an egg is one of the only foods that when you boil it, right? Most food, when you boil it, what happens? They soften. They soften, right? You take a vegetable, you take meat or whatever, right? It becomes more soft when you cook it, when you boil it, when you bake it. The egg is the opposite. It becomes hard. The longer you boil it, the harder it gets. And the idea is that the Jewish people are like an egg. The more that we're boiled, the more suffering and hardships and difficulties that we have, the stronger we get. Stronger we get. And that is what's happening in these parshas over here. The formation, the birth of the Jewish people begins with suffering. And suffering makes us strong. It makes us who we are. So this book, the book of Exodus, is the beginning of the birth of the Jewish people. We are actually born as a nation when we leave Egypt. That's when God says, I've chosen you as my nation. I've made you the Am B'nai Yisrael, the nation of Israel. That happens when we were taken out of Egypt. Up until that point, we were considered B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, the children of Yaakov. We're a family. We're a family. But we transition from family to nation in these parshas. So we are in the second parsha, the Parsha of Vaera, which kind of begins right where we left off in last week's Parsha. And in last week's Parsha, we started this dialogue that Moshe had with God at the burning bush to go to Pharaoh. Moshe eventually goes to Pharaoh, and not only does Pharaoh not agree to send the Jewish people out, but he actually makes it worse. He tells them that he's not going to help collect the straw that they need to make the bricks, and they're going to have to do it on their own. And they still have the same quota of how many bricks they have to make per day. It only gets more difficult. And the Jewish people see Moshe and Aaron, they say, what are you doing? You've only made it worse for us. You said you're a savior. You said that God has remembered us. You said that we're finally leaving Egypt. We were so excited to see you. Look what's happening. It's only getting worse. So Moshe turns to God and he says the famous words, Lama hareoisa la'am hazeh. Why have you made it more difficult for this nation? You sent me, and now it's only worse. And God says, don't worry, Moshe. It's only going to get better. You'll see the great miracles that will be performed in Egypt, and the Jewish people will leave Egypt. And that's where we open in this week's Parsha, the Parsha of Vaera, page 372, 373. Vayidaber Elokim el Moshe. Elokim spoke to Moshe. Vayomer elav, and he said to him, Ani Hashem, I am Hashem. Now, if you notice, one of the first things that come to mind is who is speaking to God? Who's speaking to Moshe? God is speaking to Moshe. But in Hebrew, we use two different names for God, right? In one verse. Vayidaber Elokim, Elokim, which is the name of God, spoke to Moshe, and he said to him, Ani Hashem, I am God, by using the Yud Kei Vav Kei name of God. And we know every name of God represents a different element of God. And Elokim is generally the idea of judgment, the severity of God, din, judgment. And Hashem, the Yud Kei Vav Kei name of God, is more compassion, the compassionate element of God. Now we hear that the commentators explain that God started off being a little bit harsh with Moshe. And God was saying, Moshe, what are you questioning me? Well, you're doubting? You're doubting God. What are you questioning me? So it was a little harsh. Why are you asking me? Lama hadayoisa, why is it getting worse? Where's your trust? Where's your emunah? Where's your faith? Well, it will all be good. So he came a little harsh and judging Moshe. But then he quickly softened up and he said, Ani Hashem, I am God. I am the compassionate God. Because ultimately, God knew and realized that why was Moshe asking Lama Harayasa? Why was he questioning God? Not because he had doubts in God, God forbid, but Moshe was expressing the feeling of the Jewish people. And as a true leader, as we call him, the faithful shepherd of the Jewish people, all that he could do was ask God, what's going on over here? Not because he didn't believe in God or trust in God, but it was a cry from within. Moshe feels his empathy. He really feels what's going on in the hearts of the Jewish people. And he's saying, why are you making it worse? Come on, figure this out, how to make it should all go easy and good. You're the all powerful God. You can make this happen. So it was coming from a place not of doubt, but it was coming from a good place. It was coming from a place of caring. Moshe fully cared for the Jewish people, and therefore he was saying, why are you making it worse? And therefore God had that compassion to him as well. I want to jump a few verses over here. To the next page. Verse 11, 10, 11, 12, 13. I'm actually going to jump further ahead. I can jump to the next page, actually, to verse 29. Verse 29, page 377. The Torah gives a little bit of the lineage, who Moshe and Aaron were, going back to Yaakov, etc. And then we say like this: "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemer." God spoke to Moshe, saying, "Ani Hashem, I am God." Daber al Pare Melech Mitzrayim. Speak to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Eis kol asher ani doived elecha. All that I am speaking to you. Right? So he tells him, Moshe, you got to speak to Pharaoh. And what does Moshe respond? Verse 30. Vayomer Moshe lifnei Hashem. Moshe said before God, Hein ani aral svasayim. I am a person with sealed lips. Aral svasayim. I don't speak well. Seemingly, he was saying, I have some type of speech impediment. And how will Pharaoh listen to me? So what does God answer? Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. God said to Moshe, Re'ei, see, nisaticha Elokim lefarei. I have made you as a Elokim, as a God, as a master over Pharaoh. Ve'aharoin ochicha yihiyeh neviyecha. And Aaron, your brother, will be your interpreter. Ata sedaber, you should speak first to Pharaoh. Eis kol asher atzaveka, all that I will command you. Ve'Aaron achicha yedaber el Parai, and Aaron, your brother, will speak to Pharaoh. V'shilach es bnei Yisrael me'aretz, and he will send the Jewish people out from his land. So what's going on over here? What it seems like, God is telling Moshe, you have a problem with your speech? Okay. You should speak to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your interpreter. And Rashi comments that this means literally that when Moshe and Aaron came to Pharaoh, Moshe spoke with his speech impediment. He spoke as he's able to speak, and the Pharaoh wouldn't necessarily understand a word. In fact, we are told that he would speak in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, and we know that Pharaoh, one of the few languages that he did not speak was the language of Hebrew. So he didn't understand what he's saying. He would speak, and then Aaron would interpret. This is what happens. So every time you hear that Moshe and Aaron went to Pharaoh, spoke to him about the plagues, what was happening is Moshe would speak in Hebrew, Pharaoh would not understand what he's saying, and then Aaron would interpret into the Egyptian language. That's what happens. Now, what's the obvious question is, what is the reason for this? What is the reason? Why would Moshe have to speak if Pharaoh wouldn't understand it either way? What's the point of it? Why couldn't Aaron directly speak to Pharaoh? Why do we need Moshe to come and speak it in Hebrew with a speech impediment? And then Aaron comes and interprets. Either God could speak directly to Aaron, as he has done many times, or if for whatever reason God wanted to speak to Moshe, let Moshe speak to Aaron, and let Aaron speak to Pharaoh. Why did Pharaoh have to listen to Moshe and Aaron? Imagine that. It was, yes. To Pharaoh? But Pharaoh doesn't understand it. Now we're dealing with these unfortunately we have these Israelis who were hit in this attack on January 1st in the French border. So they're in the hospitals over here, right? So often they need an interpreter because the doctors are coming in speaking about their medical condition in English, and they have a difficulty with English. So we need an interpreter, right? So how does the interpreter work? The doctor speaks to the interpreter, and the interpreter speaks to the patients. The patients speak to the interpreter, and the interpreter speaks to the doctors, right? That's how interpreter works, right? Okay, that's a problem that you have to deal with. But speaking directly to the person who doesn't speak your language doesn't help that, right? So for the doctor to speak to someone in English, to someone who only speaks Hebrew, it's pointless. Because if they don't speak the language, they don't know what you're talking about. So just to hear the voice and then hear from the interpreter, right? It's not like I understand the language, but I'm missing some subtleties. I don't understand the language. Pharaoh did not speak Hebrew. It was symbolic. What was symbolic?
God speaking, and he was speaking in his language with the Jewish people.
Okay, so there's something to it. There's something symbolic that Pharaoh had to hear directly the words from Moshe, even though he didn't really understand what he's saying.
Did it sort of put down Pharaoh, like to show that
Not all that.
is
This is the spoken language, even in Egypt, even in Pharaoh's palace, we are speaking Hebrew. There's something to that, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we'll develop this idea, but you're on the right track. So there's something symbolic. There's something about Moshe himself speaking the language of the Jewish people, God's language, to Pharaoh, even though seemingly he had with a speech impediment, even though he didn't know exactly what was going on. So just a few things before we get to this idea. the scholars amongst us may remember that last week, when Moshe was standing by the burning bush, one of his, attempts to, get out of this mission was, what did he say? I have a speech impediment. Right? He already tried this card, right? He already mentioned this last week. Kichvad peh. I have a heavy mouth. I have a hard time speaking. He tried it last week already. So why is he trying it again now? What? He said he mentioned this already. So Nachmanides actually says something interesting. He says if you analyze the verses, and you can go back and you can look at the verses. If you analyze the verses from last week's Parsha, you'll notice that there was no direct instruction from God that Moshe should actually speak to Pharaoh. And you can go back, you can read it, you can look at it inside. You can see God tells Moshe, go to Pharaoh, and he'll send the Jewish people out. Doesn't say speak to Pharaoh. He says speak to the Jewish people. He says speak to the elders of the Jewish people. And then Moshe says maybe they're not going to believe me. So he says, all the miracles and all the signs that he had to do to gain their trust. To gain whose trust? The Jewish people's trust. And then God says, with the elders, go to Pharaoh and speak to him. And Moshe understood that to mean that the elders would speak on his behalf because he knew he has a speech impediment. So he was never really instructed directly to speak to Pharaoh. And then what happens? This is all last week's Parsha. That the time they get to Pharaoh's palace, all of the 70 elders, one by one, they kind of chicken out and they leave them. So it's Moshe and Aaron alone who are left to speak to Pharaoh. Which, by the way, Rashi says right over there that that's the reason why that these same 70 elders, when it came to time for the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, although they were chosen to stand closer to the mountain, they were not allowed to actually step onto the mountain because they left Moshe alone then, which is interesting. But either way, so Moshe has to speak to Pharaoh directly. And then Moshe comes back, and one of the interpretations to his complaint, Lama hari oisa la'ama hazeh, why have you made it so difficult for the Jewish people? Lama zeh shalachtani, why did you send me? But the emphasis perhaps is not on why did you send me, but it's why did you send me? Why didn't you send someone else? Because Moshe, maybe he was lacking some confidence. He was saying, it's probably because of my speech. I don't speak well. So Pharaoh sees some guy coming that can't even speak properly to the royal king. This is who you're sending. This is your leader. Right? When you're choosing a leader, you want someone who has qualities, you want someone who has vision, you want someone who has, wisdom, but you also want someone who can give speeches. You want someone who speaks well, who can get up in front of a crowd and give a good speech. That's part of the qualities of a leader, you would think. And Moshe says, me? I don't have that quality. I can barely speak. I stutter right there. It's probably because I was so, unclear or whatever, because of my speech impediment. That's why it's not working. So why are you sending me? Send someone else. And that's what, I'm sorry? Here's from it. And that's why he's repeating this again, because now when God tells Moshe directly, Daber el Paro, you should speak to Pharaoh. And suddenly Moshe says, last time I told you, you said, okay, I'm just speaking to everyone else, to the Jewish people. I can manage that. But now you want me to speak directly to Pharaoh, but I have a speech impediment. Now, what exactly was the speech impediment? So Rashi says that he had a heavy mouth. He had a heavy mouth. What exactly does that mean? It's hard you can imagine that he has a hard time speaking. And Michael references the famous story in the Midrash where Moshe was a young child. As we know, he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. And at one point, they say the story where Pharaoh was sitting, maybe playing with Moshe. You familiar with the story? And he was wearing his royal crown. And Moshe, as a child, removes the crown from Pharaoh's head and places it on his own head. Oh, that's a big no-no in the palace. Oh, what's Moshe doing? He's taking the crown. Does he want to be the king? And it got so severe that the issue over here, some were saying, listen, we got to kill him. We got to kill him. He is rebelling against Pharaoh. He took his crown off his head. And others were saying, listen, Moshe, he's a little child. What does he know? He doesn't know what the crown. He sees a crown. It looks exciting. He wants to put it on his head. It's not a rebellion. We could keep back and forth. So they decided that we have to test him. We have to test his wisdom to see if he understands what jewels are, what crown is, what. So what did they do? So they took 2 plates. One plate of burning coals, which are very shiny. The other ones were like gold, silver, beautiful diamonds, precious gems. And they wanted to see which one he's going to take. And if he would take the gems, they say, "Oh, he understands what's really." If he wants to go play with the fire because it looks so exciting, then we know that he's just a young child. And of course, Moshe, being wise, was about to take the gems. And we say that the Malach Gavriel, the angel of Gabriel, the angel came and pushed Moshe's hand, touched the coals, and he got so stunned by the heat of the coals that he quickly put his hand in his mouth. And ever since then, he had some type of speech impediment. That's the story that the Midrash says. And based on that, people try to explain that perhaps this is what Rashi is referring to, that's why he had a problem with his speech. Others say, actually, Rashi's grandchild, known as the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who was, his mother was Yocheved. So we know that Rashi only had daughters. And one of his daughters' name was Yocheved, which is interesting because this week's Parsha we talk about Yocheved, right? The mother of Moshe. So Yocheved had a son Shmuel, had multiple children. Rashi had multiple grandchildren who were really great Torah scholars. And the Rashbam, known as the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel, also wrote a commentary. And he says that the speech impediment was a little bit different. He was saying that it was more about this. He didn't speak the Egyptian language. It wasn't that he couldn't speak because he had a problem with his mouth, but it was more that he just didn't know the language. And the reason for this is what he references is that, remember, Moshe was out of Egypt for how many years? At least 60 years, perhaps longer. So for 60 years, I haven't spoken the language. He was speaking the Midianite language, whatever that was, right? So he's speaking a different language. And of course, I guess he knew Hebrew. I guess maybe that was his mother language he knew best. But he didn't know, he wasn't clear, he wasn't so familiar with the language that the Pharaoh speaks. So that was what his speech impediment was. He was uncomfortable with speaking that language. Others say that he was able to speak the Egyptian language, but he just never spoke to dignitaries and royalty and to speak in the palace before Pharaoh. He wasn't so comfortable. So some people kind of minimize this issue that Moshe had, because we know Moshe was such a perfect person, so they have a hard time saying that he had a speech impediment. Whatever it is, various interpretations to what this impediment was. But the point is, he had an issue. He couldn't speak, or either physically he couldn't speak, or he didn't know the language, or he wasn't uncomfortable speaking before Pharaoh. So what did God say? God says, it's okay. You should go speak, and Aaron will be your interpreter. But as we mentioned, we want specifically that Moshe himself should speak. I heard something interesting. They call it, for orators, people who speak, they say there's the 7:38:55 rule. You heard that before? Something, if I remember correctly, it goes like this. The impact that a person has on other people through their speech, 7% of it is what they say. 38% of it is the tone, and 55% is body language. Okay, so if you ever got to give a speech, your body language is most of it. 55% of the message goes through body language. 38 is your tone, higher, lower, the way you speak, right? And 7% of it is actually the content. What did you say? Right? They say the story where like they had like back in the day where most people were illiterate, they weren't able to read. So if someone gets a letter from their child, the way in school. So the first, the town's, translator or whatever would read letters for people. So gets a letter, haven't seen their son in 6 months, out, in the big city, in Kiev or in Moscow, whatever, in school. So the letter is, Mom, I'm depleted from money. I need money. I need clothes. It's cold over here. Please help. And that's the message she got. And here's the message. She says, what? I haven't heard from him in 6 months. And this is what he sends. This is the whole letter. And he's like, she's beside herself. And for the whole weekend, she's thinking like, what's with my son? Like so cold. And so like, nothing else besides this. And then she decides to take the same letter to go to a different letter reader of the town. And the other person reads the same letter. And he reads, Mommy, I need money. It's so cold. I need clothes. Please help. And she says, oh, now he's talking like a mensch. Yeah.
That's really.
Right? The tone makes all the difference. So they say a story. I think it was with the Chafetz Chaim, one of the great Lithuanian rabbis. He says that the story goes that there was a ban being put in place by the local government against ritual slaughtering of meat, kosher meat processing, which till today in a lot of European countries is still an issue. They want to try, either they banned it or they're trying to ban it, and obviously it's devastation for the Jewish community. So there was a hearing. I don't know if it was in court or in front of the government or however it worked over there, and they brought the Chafetz Chaim, this great rabbi, to speak. The problem was it was in Russia actually. He didn't speak Russian, or he maybe spoke the Russian, the broken. He couldn't really speak. He couldn't give a speech in Russian. So he came and he gave a speech in Yiddish, which was his spoken language. Problem is, no one over there spoke Yiddish, so they had an interpreter. So he was going to give his speech, however long it was going to last, and then there was going to be an interpreter to interpret the Yiddish speech into Russian so people could understand. So he gets up there and he gives his passionate speech for whatever 15, 20 minutes, all about the importance of Jewish rituals and for the Jewish community and why we should not ban the kosher meat processing. And before the interpreter gets up, the judge or whoever it was tells the interpreter, it's okay, I got the message. It's off the table, right? He was successful just by speaking with the passion, the whatever it was. He got the message, even though he didn't actually know exactly what he said. There was a mission over here for Moshe to go to Pharaoh. What exactly was the mission? Of course, we wanted Pharaoh to hear the words and understand what God is speaking to him and that he's being warned and there's a plagues coming. He has to send the Jewish people out. Pharaoh got that. So sometimes there's a technicality, he had to know what's going on. So he needed an interpreter. But there was a message over here and something that Lance and Jill touched upon. What did Pharaoh represent? Pharaoh was the ultimate egotistic person. All he believed in was himself. Pharaoh actually believed that he was a deity. He was God. He believed the Nile River comes from me. We spoke last week, right? The Nile was like the source of life in Egypt. He actually claimed that he created the Nile. So the Nile River, which was the deity of the Egyptian, really, Pharaoh says, that's me. I'm in charge. So much so, by the way, we know, interesting, if you notice, and you'll see in this week's Parsha, next week's Parsha, multiple times, God tells Moshe, go to Pharaoh in the morning, you'll meet him at the Nile River. Well, why is Pharaoh, he takes his morning walks at the Nile River? What was he doing at the Nile River? So we are told is that Pharaoh claimed to be this God. And if you're a God, you'll never have to, you never have to use the wash, you use the bathroom, right? So he would hide. Early morning, he would go to the Nile River.
Nobody was allowed to
No,
do anything.
no, right. So Moshe would meet him right then. And Moshe would meet him and show him, listen, I know what's going on over here. So God wanted to break Pharaoh. And how do we break Pharaoh? For Pharaoh to recognize that there is a God other than him. He isn't the God. There's something greater than him. The God of the Jewish people. That was the message. The message was to break Pharaoh. So the content we got through Aaron. He figured out what exactly the message was, like what exactly the words that God was using. But the idea that there is a God and God is speaking to Pharaoh, that came through Moshe. And that's why God wanted that Moshe, you speak in Hebrew, speak with your speech impediment. It's not important. I want Pharaoh to hear your voice. I want Pharaoh to hear the Hebrew language from God being spoken to him in his palace. And that itself is going to break him. Now, there's also specific messages I need him to know, to find. So for that, you have Aaron. Aaron will pass it on. But it wasn't just enough to pass it on through Aaron, because God wants specifically that Moshe himself bringing the exact words of God to Pharaoh. And that's why we had Moshe and Aaron, this partnership. And it wasn't just enough just to take Aaron without Moshe. And I think this idea in our lives as well, we have like these two sides to us, as a parent, for example. We have the Moshe side to us and we have the Aaron side to us. When we speak to our children, we like to be like the Aaron. Aaron is the one who interprets. We know that Aaron also, we know from later in his life, he was the peacemaker. He was the one that was able to really relate to the other people and to work things out and work things through and to mediate and to figure things out with others and bring peace to other people. He was really on that level. He was on the level of the Jewish people. And he's like the interpreter. He takes the ideas and he interprets and makes it relevant. And he's like the parent who is getting down on the floor, playing with the children, and he's talking to them on their language, on their level, and he's having fun with them. He's almost like a friend to the children, and really kind of relating and bonding with them on that level. Which today I think that's what we need for the most part. As parents, we have to really, sometimes there's a generational gap, and our children say, "Oh, you don't understand me. You don't know, you're right. What I'm going through," and there's truth to that. And as parents, we try to kind of be that friend, and we want our children to feel that my parent is a friend of mine. I could open up to them. I could relate to them. So that's important. It's important as parents. It's important as grandparents also, right? To try to kind of be on that level with the children. But at the same time, you also need a Moshe. You also need the Moshe element, where you also have to have certain set boundaries, like a Moshe just giving over the word of God. This is what it's meant to be, right? So you have to have that balance where you have the Aaron, where you want to kind of go with the flow and be that like good, buddies with our children. But that's not enough, because we also have to have that time where we say, this is right, this is wrong. These are our values. This is right. There's some discipline in education as well, even though sometimes we just love to shower them with love, and that's like the easier way. But ultimately, we also have to have that foundation. These are our values. This is right, this is wrong. Kind of lay that out. And then we also have to put on our Aaron hat and say, okay, how am I interpreting that? How am I passing this on in a way where they're going to accept it and embrace it and not throw it away? So we need that Moshe and that Aaron together in our lives, and with our children, with our spouses, with our communities, wherever that is, wherever it can be applied. And that's my little message for this morning's Parsha class. So I leave you with that. Thank you for joining us this morning. Have a Shavua Tov, and hope to see you next week. All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good week. We're getting
Take care.
snow here.